So, what I want to talk you through today is quite important because you're going to need it for your assignment. At least one of the pages you're going to use, or one of the pages you're going to have in your website, is going to have a 3-column layout, it's called. And it's going to be like 3 columns, kind of like in a magazine. So in the bad old days of HTML, before we started doing things properly with CSS, if you wanted a web page that had a fancy magazine style layout, you would become the king of tables. You'd become a table guru, and you'd know every trick there was about tables, and every one of your pages would be a big huge feck off table. And then you'd have like different columns for different things. You'd have your rows, and you have your col spans and your row spans all over the shop, and that's how you'd do stuff. We don't do that anymore. There should be no reason for you to have any tables in your website at all. So if you're using tables, you need to ask yourself, are you doing something you shouldn't be doing? Just lest it not be said, I think it goes without saying that you can't go into Photoshop, do up your whole website, save it as a big huge JPEG, and let that be your assignment. Okay? People have done that in the past and it didn't end well. Like, making your site one big image is not an option. But I think that goes without saying. No. So what we're going to look at in this class is how to do a 3-column layout with CSS. And the first thing we need to get to grips with is float. So here on this page, I could show you the source, but actually the source isn't important. What's important is the CSS. And we have this image of a boat. That's the first thing on the page. And then after that we have a whole bunch of text. And normally you might expect the text to start here, or perhaps even under the boat. But in this case, in the CSS, we've used the float property, which has pushed the boat over to the left. We've said float left. Okay? And that pushes the boat over to the left and then causes the stuff that comes after it to wrap around it. If I go change the CSS, this is going to be a disaster because whenever I change code live in class, it's always a disaster. If ever you become a lecturer, don't do this. It just never works. And here, it's over here on the right. My browser's a bit wide. Now it's pushed over to the right and all the text has wrapped around it. So that's float left and right. If you don't want the stuff that comes after things that are floating to wrap around them, there's a thing you can use called clear, which will, so this here is applying to the text now. You can clear the text, which means that it won't wrap around the things that are floating, it'll come underneath. You can clear left or clear right or clear both. In this case, if I clear both, the boat will still float over to the right, but the text will come underneath it. It won't wrap around. So that's float left and float right. What we're going to look at now is the structure of a 3-column layout, which is what I have here. Now, this is done with divs and various properties applied to them. In this example, I have a section up the top, a div that's, for the header, and a bit at the bottom that's for the footer. Actually, in the newer version of HTML, there are actually header and footer tags that you would use for your header and your footer. But I think if I look at the code here, we won't find those. No. So, let's look first at the HTML for all of this. So, we have a bunch of divs. You might have mentioned when I first introduced divs, I said they didn't do very much, but we use them a lot in CSS. And it's pretty much what we do. They don't do very much by themselves, but they let us have nice containers that we can use. So, blah, blah, blah up the top there. So the whole page is a big div that wraps up the whole page. So there's a container that wraps up the whole page. And then inside in that container, we have a div with an ID of header, a div with an ID of left container. Notice up next we have a div with an ID right container, and then we have the center container, and then we have a footer. So this is the content of the page. So the question then is, how do we stop all these things from appearing one after the other, like you'd expect, and have the stuff on the left pushed over to the left, and the stuff on the right pushed over to the right, and the stuff we want in the middle? Well, that's where floating comes in. So, some properties here that we can use. Here I've set the minimum width of the page container to 200 pixels. So it can't be smaller than 200. I initially had it set to a maximum of 600, so that if you stretch it very, very wide, it still only stayed a certain width. So if a person had a super, super, super wide screen, it still only has kind of modest proportions and stays in the center there. I can't show you this because as soon as I plug my computer into the projector, the screen resolution drops to 600. So to show you this, I'd have to go off the screen and you wouldn't see it. But that's something you might want to do, is to set the minimum and the maximum width of the page. We could probably see the minimum width at work. If I squish this in really small, you can see it's squishing, for want of a better technical term, as the page comes in. Then there comes a point where it says, no more, I'm stopping. That point there that we just reached is at the 200 pixel width. Just to show you that, I'll set that to say 400 and save. Refresh, and now it'll stop collapsing. Or collapsing isn't the word either. I like squishing. Squishing was a good word. It'll stop squishing at 400 pixels. So that's something you might want to do, because it could be very hard for you to design a page that would look good, when it's 100 pixels wide, or when it's 200 pixels wide, or even 300, or even 400 pixels wide. So you might say, well, look, this is as low as I go in terms of size, and you can also say this is as wide as I go. I'll set the minimum to 300, and we'll set the maximum to 400, so you can see what I'm talking about. So here, save, refresh. So here the page squashes in and keeps squishing until we get to 300, and then it won't squish anymore. Between 300 and 400, it expands out, it stretches with the window, and then it comes to a certain point where it won't stretch anymore. So this constrains, the range in which your design would have to work. And so a person can have as much real estate in the screen as they want. This isn't budging wider than that. Okay? And set it to 500 just to be more realistic. Now, the left margin and right margin there are important. So this is the left margin and this is the right margin. And we've set those to auto. And what that does then is it'll have the page, as we know it, plonked there in the middle of the window, which is handy. So you notice we haven't said we want this to be in the center of the page. We just want the left and the right margins to be decided automatically. So that's handy. And so there we go. Now, I've set the border to yellow there and given it a 5 pixels width, just so you can see that this yellow line here is that particular div. Okay? No. This isn't really important, the header and the footer there. It's not really doing much. Now, the left container the most important feature of this is that it's floating left. So that's what pushes us over to the left. Okay? And I've given it a color there in the background just so we can see that that's the left container. That's that lovely shade of pink there with the black text. And here we've set the width to 25%. Now percentages are very can be very tricky in CSS, because if you talk about a percentage, if you have any relative measure, whether it's an M or an X, for example, they're relative measures, or even a percentage, it's not, you have to be very, very careful. You're talking about 25% of what? So this is the width of this left container is 25% of whatever it's inside. So this here takes up 25% of this yellow container. Not 25% of the screen, for example. So sometimes in CSS you have to be very, very careful. If you think about it, it makes sense, but you often have to think hard about what's going on with your measurements. So this container here, left container, has a width of 25%. Okay? The right one has a width of 25%, and it's floating right, and that's over there. No. This then is where it starts to get interesting. So the center container then, the contents of that are obviously just going to come along here, and when the left and right containers run out of steam, it's just going to wrap around them. But we see here that it doesn't wrap around them, it keeps going straight down. As he says, he puts his hand on the screen as if you can see the screen. So it keeps coming down like that. And that's achieved by specifying the left and right margins of that center container. So here we're saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment these out. So this is what you'd expect to happen. That thing's this is floating left, this is floating right, the stuff that comes after it comes along and then, wraps around it as it comes down. But what we're doing is we're giving this center div a width. Oh, that's it. Yeah, don't deny it. I thought all the wasps would be dead by now. But yeah. This is a bit where I come to your rescue, but oh yeah, now it's really pissed off. Yeah, flicking your hair at it's not gonna make it happier. Yeah. Okay, it's busy looking for new prey. No. So yeah, just because I'm the oldest person in this room doesn't mean I have any special insight on how to kill wasps. I'm as helpless as the rest of you. See, cleaning all those spider webs doesn't seem like such a good idea now, does it? Anyway, he's back. Okay. We could open a window and let it go out. How about that? It's not quite as, manly, but if he just ran away, that would help. I think waving a half-empty can of Coke at it is not going to... Yeah. Okay, he's still there. Just... Yeah.
Catch by the wings.
I'm crushed that I'm no longer the most interesting thing in the room. Anyway, let's pretend it's not there and see what happens. That's how we usually deal with problems in Ireland, isn't it? No. So, here, we're going to set the left margin of that container to 25% and the margin right to 25%. And then it still wraps around, but it just happens to have a gap that's exactly the right size. In fact, I'm going to change that to 15 just so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's 15% left here and 15% left here. If we make that 25 and 25, we'll get a clean line there. It would even make sense actually to have it greater than 25, so they're not brushing up right against each other. We can maybe that 28 and 28. So then we get something like that. Now, you'll notice that it's a bit unsatisfactory in that the background of this element here doesn't come all the way down, nor does this one. Also, if this is particularly short, let's see if I can get the code there for that, it can be a bit unsatisfactory as well. Yuck. Okay. What would you think we'd need to do there to make that work okay? No takers? No, I suspect, and I'm only speculating, I suspect if we go to the header and the footer, and if we say, let's say for the footer anyway, if we say footer clear both, at least it might push the footer down to the bottom. Phew, I'm glad that worked. That would have been embarrassing. Okay. So that's something we can do anyway. Yeah, no, you have to really commit. Like, you have to hit it to kill it, you know? Just being mean won't work. No, he's just mad.
Where is it?
There.
Where's it then? He's got brain damage.
Yeah.
Go on, Phil. Go on, Phil. Go on, Phil.
I don't think you're that tall, really. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's just screwing with you now. Okay. So there are things you can do that will make this a bit more satisfying, and I'll try and put an example online for you. What you can do is if you know, for example, that if you decide you're not going to have a flexible layout, if you decide actually this is just going to be 600 wide and I don't care, 600 is going to be 600 and that's it, well then what you can do is you can actually put a nice background on the main container, and rather than coloring the left container and the right container and having background colors, you could leave them transparent and put in a nice background that simulates the colors behind there. I'll try and put an example of that on the website for you. I had one there, but I couldn't find it. So that's a 3-column layout, and that's a very important thing that you need to be able to do in CSS. And you'll see variations on this all over the shop. Just to point out there, I have in the CSS or in the HTML created a div called footer and another div called header, but in HTML5 there's actually footer and header tags that you'd use specifically for those purposes, and then they come with some built-in properties that are useful. Any questions on that? Any questions now on the assignment while we're thinking about it or talking about it? You really should have picked your theme by now, and you should be well on your way. You want to spend a lot of time getting this one page right. Okay? And the whole point of CSS is that when you have one page done, 5 or 500 then is trivial. Okay? So you want to spend a lot of time on, say, your 3-column layout. For your other pages, then you might decide you're just going to go with a 2-column. To do that, you just rip out one of the columns, leave everything else the same, and it'll probably look fabulous. No. So, okay. So I'm going to have to admit defeat to the wasp, and we'll call it a day there. Okay.